Chapter 106, The Grave Digger. 3 days after the events related in the preceding chapter, and at that hour in the cold wintry morning when the dawn breaks in fitful gleams through a dense atmosphere of a dark neutral dye, a laboring man with a shovel and pickaxe upon his shoulder entered one of the cemeteries in the immediate vicinity of Globe Lane. This cemetery was only partly enclosed by houses. On the remaining sides there was a low wall. The soil was damp, and a nauseous odor emanated from it, impregnating the air. When the sun lay for several days upon the place, even in the depth of winter, and invariably throughout the summer, the stench was so intolerable that not a dwelling in the neighborhood was seen with a window open. Nevertheless, that sickly, fetid odor penetrated into every house and every room and every inhabited nook and corner in that vicinity, and the clothes of the poor inmates smelt and their food tasted of the damp grave. The cemetery was crowded with the remains of mortality. The proprietors of the ground had only one aim in view, namely, to crowd the greatest possible quantity of corpses into the smallest space. But even this economy of room did not prevent the place from being so filled with the dead that in a given quantity of the soil it was difficult to say whether earth or decayed human remains predominated. Still, the cemetery was kept open for interments, and when there was no room for a newcomer, some recently buried tenant of a grave was exhumed to afford the required space. In one part of the ground was a rude brick building denominated a bone house. This hovel was provided with a large fireplace, and seldom did a day pass without smoke being seen to issue from the chimney. On those occasions when the furnace was lighted, the stench from the cemetery was always more powerful than at other times. Some of the poor inhabitants of the adjoining houses had remonstrated with the parochial authorities on the subject of this nuisance being tolerated, but the only reply the applicants could obtain was, "Well, prefer an indictment at the session if you don't like it." The idea of men in the receipt of 8 or 10 shillings a week preferring an indictment, such a process is only accessible to those possessed of ample means, or the legislature was purposely rendered law. That is, the power of obtaining justice, enforcing rights, and suppressing nuisances, a luxury obtainable only by money. So they're basically saying, if you don't like the smell, sue us, take us to court. And they're like, we're poor, how are we going to afford to take you to court? And they're like, exactly. The poor indeed, whoever thought of legislating for the poor? Legislate against them, and it is all well and good. Heap statute upon statute, pile act upon act, accumulate measure upon measure, encumber the most simple forms with the most intricate technicalities, diversify readings, and expand in verbiage until the sense becomes unintelligible. Convert the whole legal scheme into a cunning web, so that the poor man cannot walk 3 steps without entangling his foot in one of those meshes of whose very existence he was previously unaware, and whose nature he cannot comprehend even when involved therein. Do all this, and you are a wise and sound statesman. For this is legislating against the poor, and who, we repeat, would ever think of legislating for them? But to continue. The gravedigger entered the cemetery and cast a glance around him. That glance well expressed the man's thoughts, for he mentally asked himself, whose grave must I disturb now to make room for the new one? At length he advanced towards a particular spot, considered it for a moment, and then struck his spade into the soil as much as to say, this will do. The place where he had now halted was only a few yards from the bone house. Taking a key from his pocket, he proceeded to unlock the door of that building. Entering the bone house, he took from amongst a quantity of implements in one corner a long, flexible iron rod similar to those which we have already described as being used by the body snatchers. Returning to the grave, he thrust the rod into the ground. It met with a little resistance from some substance a little harder than the soil, but the man pushed it downwards with a strong arm, and it sank to at least 12 feet in the ground. Satisfied with this essay of the nature of the spot, the gravedigger drew back the rod, and from the deep but narrow aperture thus formed issued a stench more pestiferous than that which ever came from the lowest knacker's yard. The man retreated rapidly to the bone house. That odor was too powerful even for one who had passed the greater portion of his life in that very graveyard. He now proceeded to light a fire in the bone house, and when he saw the huge logs which he heaped on the grate blazing brightly, he covered them with coke. The current of air from the open door fanned the flames which roared up the chimney, and the gravedigger felt invigorated and cheered by the genial warmth that issued from the ample grate. After lingering for a few minutes in the bone house, the gravedigger returned to the spot which he had previously marked for excavation. Bearing his brawny arms to the very shoulders, he now set himself vigorously to work to dig the grave which was to receive a newcomer that afternoon. Throwing the earth up on either side, he had digged to a depth of about 2 feet when a spade encountered a coffin. He immediately took his pickaxe, broke the coffin to pieces, and then separated with his shovel the pieces of wood and the human bones from the damp earth. The coffin was already so soft with decay that the iron rod had penetrated through it without much difficulty, and it therefore required but little exertion to break it up altogether. But the odor which came from the grave was now of the most nauseating kind, fetid, sickly, pestiferous, making the atmosphere heavy and the human breath thick and clammy, as it were, and causing even that experienced grave-digger to retch as if he were about to vomit. Leaping from the grave, he began to busy himself in conveying the pieces of the broken coffin and the putrid remains of mortality into the bone house, where he heaped them pell-mell upon the fire. The flesh had not completely decayed all away from the bones. A thick, black, fatty-looking substance still covered those human relics, and the fire was thus fed with a material which made the flames roar and play half up the chimney. And from the summit of that chimney came a smoke thick, dense, and dark, like the smoke of a gasometer or a manufactory, but bearing on its sable wing the odor of pestilence. The man returned to the grave and was about to resume his labor, when his eyes caught sight of a black object almost embedded in the damp clay heaped up by the side. He turned it over with his spade. It was the upper part of the skull, with the long, dark hair of a woman still remaining attached to it. The gravedigger coolly took up the relic by that long hair, which perhaps had once been a valued ornament, and carrying it in this manner into the bone house, threw it upon the fire. The hair hissed for a moment as it burnt, for it was damp and clogged with clay. Then the voracious flames licked up the thin coat of blackened flesh which had still remained on the skull, and lastly devoured the bone itself. The gravedigger returned to his toils, and at a depth of scarcely 1 foot below the coffin, thus exhumed and burnt, his shovel was again impeded for a moment by another coffin. Once more was the pickaxe put into requisition. A second coffin was broken up. Another decomposing, but not entirely composed corpse was hacked and hewed and rent to pieces by the merciless implement, which was wielded by a merciless arm. And in a few moments the fire in the bone house burnt cheerfully once more, the mouth of the chimney vomiting forth its dense and pest-bearing breath, the volume of which was from time to time lighted with sparks and flakes of fire. And thus was it that this gravedigger disposed of the old tenants of the cemetery in order to make room for new ones. And then fond, surviving relations and friends speak of the last home and the quiet resting place of the deceased. They talk with affectionate reverence of those who sleep in the grave, and they grow pathetic in their eulogies at the tranquil slumber of the tomb. Poor deluded creatures! While they are thus engaged in innocent discourse, a discourse that affords them solace when they ponder upon the loss which they have sustained, the last home is invaded, the quiet resting place is rudely awakened with sacrilegious echoes, the sleep of the grave is disturbed by the thunder of a pickaxe, and the corpse is snatched from the tranquil slumber of the tomb to be cast into the all-devouring furnace of the bone house. The gravedigger proceeded in his task, and a third coffin was speedily encountered. Each successive one was more decayed than that which had preceded it, and thus the labor of breaking them up diminished in severity. But the destination of one and all was the same, the fire of the bone house. No wonder that the cemetery continued to receive so many fresh tenants, although the neighbors knew that it must be full. No wonder that the stench was always more pestiferous when the furnace of the bone house was lighted. And that man, that gravedigger, performed his task, his odious task, without compunction and without remorse. He was fulfilling the commands of his employers. His employers were his superiors, and surely his superiors must know what was right and what was wrong. And so the gravedigger worked and toiled, and the fire in the bone house burnt cheerfully, and the dark, thick smoke was borne over the whole neighborhood like a plague cloud. 2 hours had passed away since the man had commenced his work, and he now felt hungry. Retiring to the bone house, he took a coffee pot from the shelf and proceeded to make some coffee, the material for which was in a cupboard in a corner of the building. Water he took from a large pitcher and also kept in that foul place, and bread he had brought with him in his pockets. He drew a stool close to the fire, and when the coffee boiled, commenced his meal. The liquid cheered and refreshed him, but he never once recollected that it had been heated by flames fed with human flesh and bones. While he was thus occupied, he heard footsteps approaching the bone house, and in a few moments Mr. Banks, the undertaker, appeared upon the threshold. "Mornin', sir," said the gravedigger. "Come to have a look at the size of the grave, suppose? You've no call to be afeard. I'll be bound to make it big enough." "I hope it won't be a very deep one, Jones," returned the undertaker. "Somehow or another, the friends of the blessed defunct are averse to a deep grave." My orders is to dig 16 feet and shore up the sides as deepens, said Jones. Don't you see that I shall throw the earth on very light, so it won't take scarcely no trouble to shovel it out again? Because the next 7 as comes to this ground must all go into that there grave. 16 feet, said the undertaker in dismay. It will never do, Jones. The friends of the dear deceased wouldn't sleep quiet in their beds if they thought he had to sleep so deep in this one. It won't do, Jones. It won't do. My orders is such from the proprietor, sir, answered the gravedigger, munching and drinking at intervals with considerable calmness. Now I tell you what it is, Jones, continued the undertaker after a moment's pause. Not another grave will I ever order in this ground, and not another carcass that I undertake shall come here, unless you choose to comply with my wishes concerning this blessed old defunct. Well, Mr. Banks, there isn't a gentleman what undertakes in all Globe Town, or from Bonner's Fields down to Mile End Gate, that I'd sooner oblige than yourself, said Jones the gravedigger, but if it so be I transgress my orders. Who will know it, interrupted Banks. You have whole and sole charge of the grounds, and it can't be often that the proprietors come to trouble you. Well, sir, there is somewhat in that. And then, instead of 5 shillings for yourself, I should not hesitate to make it 10. That's business, Mr. Banks. How deep must the grave be? How deep is it already? A matter of 9 feet, sir, said Jones. Then not another inch must you move, cried the undertaker emphatically, and here's the 10 bob as earnest. Mr. Banks accordingly counted 10 shillings into the hands of the gravedigger. When's the funeral a-comin', sir? Asked Jones after a pause. At 2 precisely, replied Mr. Banks. Real parson, or one of your men as usual? Continued the gravedigger inquiringly. Oh, a friend of mine, a very pious, savory, soul-loving vessel, Jones, a man that it'll do your heart good to hear. But I say, Jones, added the undertaker, you're getting uncommon full here. Yes, full now. Full enough, sir, but I makes room. I see you do, said Banks, glancing towards the fire. What an offensive smell it makes. And would you believe that I can scarcely support it myself sometimes, Mr. Banks, returned Jones, but after all, our ground isn't so bad as some of the others in London. I know it isn't, observed the undertaker. Now ain't it an odd thing, sir, continued the gravedigger, that persons which dwell up in decent neighborhoods like, and seems exceedin' proud of their fine houses and handsome shops, shouldn't notice the foul air that comes from places only hid by a low wall or a thin paling? It is indeed odd enough, said Mr. Banks. Well, I knows the diggers in some of the yards more west, continued Jones, and I've heard from them over and over again that they pursues just the very same course as we does here, has a bone house or some such convenient place, and burns the coffins and bones that is turned up. I suppose it is necessary, Jones, observed Mr. Banks. Necessary, sir? Of course it be, exclaimed the gravedigger. Only fancy what a lot of burials takes place every year in London, and room must be made for 'em somehow or another. I know something about that, said the undertaker. Calculations have been made which proves that the average life of us poor weak creatures is 35 years. So if London contains 1.5 million people, 1.5 million persons dies and is buried in the course of every 35 years. Isn't that a fine thing for them that's in the undertaking line? Because it's quite clear that there's 1.5 million funerals in every 35 years in this blessed city. And 1.5 million graves or vaults required, said Jones. Well then, who the deuce can blame us for burning up the old ones to make room for the new ones? Who indeed, echoed Mr. Banks. The other day I had an undertaking which was buried in Enon Chapel, St. Clement's Lane, down there by Lincoln's Inn, you know. The chapel surrounded by houses all occupied by poor people, and the stench is horrid. The fact is that the chapel's divided into 2 stories. The upper one is the preaching place, and the underneath one is the burial place. There's only a common boarded floor to separate 'em. You go down by a trapdoor in the floor, and pits is dug below for the coffins. Why, at one end the place is so full that the coffins is piled up till they touch the ceiling. That is, the floor of the chapel itself, and there's only a few inches of earth over 'em. The common sewer runs through the place, so that with that and the coffins and carcasses, it's a nice hole. Worse than this, said Jones. Of course it is, returned Banks, because at all events this is out in the open air, while the other's shut up and close. And I'll tell you what it is, Jones, continued the undertaker, sinking his voice as if he were afraid of being overheard by a stranger. The people that lives in that densely populated quarter about St. Clement's Lane exists in the midst of a pestilence. Why, they breathe nothing but the putrid stench of the Enon burial place, the green ground in Portugal Street, and the almshouse burying ground down at the bottom of the lane. All that'll breed a plague one of these days in the very middle of London, observed Jones. Not a doubt of it, said the undertaker, but I haven't done yet all I had to say about that quarter. Very soon after a burial takes place at Enon Chapel, a strange-looking, long, narrow, black fly crawls out of the coffin. It is a production of the putrefaction of the dead body. But what do you think? Next season this fly is succeeded by another kind of insect, just like that common bug and with wings. The children that go to Sunday school at the chapel calls them body bugs. Them insects is seen all through the summer flying or crawling about the chapel. All the houses that overlooks the chapel are infested with rats, and if a poor creature only hangs a bit of meat out his window in summertime, in a few hours it grows putrid. Well, Mr. Banks, sir, said Jones, after reflecting profoundly for some moments, it's very lucky that you ain't one of them chaps which writes books of nonsense. Why so, Jones? 'Cause if you was to print all that you've been tellin' me, you'd make the fortunes of them new cemeteries that's opened all round London, and in the consequence would be that the grounds in London would have to shut up shop. Very true, Jones, but what I'm saying to you now is only in confidence and by way of chat. Why, do you know that the people round about the burying grounds in London, this one as well as any other, have seen the walls of their rooms covered at times with a sort of thick fatty fluid which produces a smell that's quite horrid? Look at that burying place in Drury Lane. It is so full of blessed carcasses that the ground is level with the first floor windows of the houses around it. Well, it's a happy thing to know that the world don't trouble themselves with these here matters, said Jones. In my ground I clears and clears away coffins and bodies both alike as quick as I turns 'em up. What a sight of coffin nails I sell every month to the marine store dealers, and yet people passes by them shops and sees second-hand coffin furniture put out for sale and never thinks of how it got there and where it comes from. Of course they don't, cried Banks. What the devil do you think would become of many trades if people always wondered and wondered how they supported themselves? You speaks like a book, Mr. Banks, sir, said Jones. After all, I've often thought what a fool I am not to sell the coffin wood for fuel, as most other grave diggers does in grounds that's obliged to be cleared of the old uns to make room for the new uns. But I say, Mr. Banks, sir, I've often been going to ask you a question about summit, and I always forget it. But talking of these things puts me in mind of it. What's the reason, sir, that gentlemen in the undertaking line very often bore holes right through the coffins? That's what we call tapping the coffins, Jones, answered Mr. Banks, and we do it whenever a body is going to remain at home 2 or 3 days with the coffin lid screwed down before the funeral takes place. Poor people generally buries on Sunday. Well, perhaps the coffin's took home on Wednesday or Thursday, and then the body's put in, the lid screwed tight down at once to save trouble when Sunday comes. Then we tap the coffin to let out the gas, because there is a gas formed by the decomposition of dead bodies. Well, all that's a cut above me, said Jones, and now that I must get back to work— Not at that grave, mind, interrupted the undertaker. It mustn't be another inch deeper. Not a bit, sir. I ain't going to touch it, but I've got another place to open, so here goes. With these words, the gravedigger rose from his seat and walked slowly out of the bone house. At 2 o'clock, Jones, I shall be here with the funeral, said Mr. Banks. Very good, sir, returned Jones. The undertaker then left the burial ground, and the gravedigger proceeded to open another pit. Okay, so that chapter was basically a look into the situation in London when it came to cemeteries and graves. They were so full and overflowing that they repurposed graves. So, ugh. And yet it kind of makes sense when you think about it. And you know that the grave he's digging now that they don't want to be too deep is the old man who's being buried with his money, because the resurrection man, the buffer, are going to come dig him up, right? You know that's what that is. So I'm imagining that's what's going to happen in the next chapter. So we'll see you for the next chapter.